In the shadowed corridors of the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, where power brokers once whispered their schemes and ambitions echoed off marble walls, a man sat contemplating the nature of human control. Niccolò Machiavelli, having witnessed the rise and fall of princes, the machinations of the church, and the brutal realities of political survival, understood something that most people spend their entire lives refusing to acknowledge: the world operates on principles that have nothing to do with fairness, morality, or justice. It operates on power. The year was 1513, and Machiavelli had just completed what would become one of history's most controversial works, The Prince. But, within those pages, and scattered throughout his other writings, lay not just advice for rulers, but fundamental laws of human nature that, once understood, could liberate anyone from the invisible chains of manipulation and control. These laws are not pleasant truths. They do not comfort or console. Instead, they reveal the mechanisms by which some people dominate others, and, more importantly, how to recognize and neutralize these attempts at control. Part 1: The Foundation of Control. The first revelation came to Machiavelli during his imprisonment in the dungeons beneath Florence. Accused of conspiracy against the Medici family, he found himself at the mercy of forces beyond his apparent control. Yet it was in this moment of powerlessness that he began to understand the true nature of power itself. Power, he realized, was not something that existed in isolation. It was a relationship, a dynamic between those who exercised it and those who submitted to it. More crucially, he understood that this submission was often voluntary, even when those submitting believed themselves to be victims of circumstance. The first law: never appear too perfect. The morning sun filtered through the narrow windows of the Medici palace as Lorenzo the Magnificent held court. Machiavelli, still a young man then, observed how the prince conducted himself among his subjects. What struck him was not Lorenzo's obvious displays of wealth or power, but something far more subtle. Despite being one of the most powerful men in Italy, Lorenzo deliberately displayed minor flaws: a slight stutter when excited, a tendency to spill wine on his robes during dinner, moments of apparent uncertainty when making decisions. At first, this seemed like weakness. But Machiavelli noticed something remarkable: the more human Lorenzo appeared, the more his subjects loved him. The more they loved him, the less they questioned his authority. Those who appeared perfect, Machiavelli observed, inspired envy and resentment. People could not relate to perfection, and what they could not relate to, they eventually sought to destroy. This law operates on a fundamental principle of human psychology: people need to feel superior to those they follow, even if only in small ways. When someone appears flawless, others feel diminished by comparison. This creates a psychological resistance that manifests as criticism, rebellion, or sabotage. However, when a person in authority deliberately reveals minor imperfections, mistakes that don't undermine their competence but make them appear human, others feel comfortable in their presence. The key lies in controlling which flaws you reveal. A leader might admit to being terrible at remembering names while demonstrating exceptional strategic thinking. A teacher might confess to struggling with new technology while showing mastery of their subject matter. These controlled vulnerabilities create connection without compromising respect. In modern contexts, this law explains why politicians who admit to small personal struggles often fare better than those who present themselves as flawless. It explains why the most effective managers are those who can laugh at their minor mistakes while maintaining authority over major decisions. The law protects you from control by preventing others from using your perceived perfection as a weapon against you. The second law: master the art of timing. Machiavelli's understanding of timing came from watching Cesare Borgia, a man who understood that power was not just about what you did, but when you did it. Borgia once told Machiavelli, "A decision made at the wrong time is worse than no decision at all. But a mediocre decision made at the perfect moment can change the course of history." During the siege of Imola in 1502, Machiavelli witnessed Borgia's tactical brilliance. The city had resisted for months, its defenders growing more confident with each day they held out. Lesser commanders might have continued the siege indefinitely or launched a desperate assault. Instead, Borgia waited. He waited for the moment when the city's food supplies reached a critical point, when morale began to crack, when word came that their expected reinforcements had been delayed. Only then did he strike, not with overwhelming force, but with a carefully calculated display of strength that convinced the defenders that resistance was futile. The siege ended not with bloodshed, but with surrender. The timing had been perfect, and the result was achieved with minimal cost. This taught Machiavelli that those who control timing control outcomes.
In human relationships and professional environments, timing governs everything.
The same request made at different moments will receive vastly different responses. A proposal introduced when your boss is stressed about quarterly reports will be rejected, while the identical proposal presented after a successful client meeting might be enthusiastically approved.
Understanding timing means reading the emotional and circumstantial landscape before acting.
It means recognizing when someone is receptive to new ideas and when they are defensive.
It means knowing when to press an advantage and when to retreat. Most importantly, it means understanding that patience is not passivity, it is the active choice to wait for the optimal moment. Those who master timing cannot be easily controlled because they do not react impulsively to pressure or manipulation. They respond when conditions favor their success, not when others demand immediate action.
This law protects you from being rushed into poor decisions or manipulated through artificial urgency. The third law, control information, control everything. The lesson of information control came to Machiavelli through his work as a diplomatic secretary. In this role, he discovered that knowledge was not just power, it was the source of all power. Those who controlled what information flowed where, and when, effectively controlled the decisions of everyone around them. He observed this principle in action during the complex negotiations between Florence and France in 1504. The French ambassador possessed detailed intelligence about Florence's military capabilities, financial situation, and internal political tensions. Armed with this knowledge, he was able to negotiate terms that heavily favored France, not through threats or force, but simply by knowing exactly which concessions Florence could and could not afford to make. Meanwhile, the Florentine negotiators, working with incomplete information about French intentions and capabilities, found themselves constantly reacting rather than leading the negotiations. They made concessions they didn't need to make and held firm on points that ultimately didn't matter. Information asymmetry had decided the outcome before the negotiations even began. This law operates on multiple levels. At its most basic, it means staying informed about matters that affect your life and interests. But, more importantly, it means controlling the information others have about you. In any interaction, the person with better information holds the advantage. In professional settings, this might mean understanding not just your own department's goals, but the broader company strategy, the competitive landscape, and the personal motivations of key decision-makers. It means being selective about what personal information you share, understanding that anything you reveal can and will be used to predict and influence your behavior. The law also involves recognizing information warfare when it's being waged against you. When someone consistently asks probing questions while revealing little about themselves, when you find your private conversations being repeated back to you through third parties, or when decisions are being made based on information you weren't given access to, you are likely being subjected to information control. Protection lies in developing your own information networks, being strategic about what you reveal and to whom, and always seeking to understand the full context of any situation before making important decisions. The mechanisms of manipulation. As Machiavelli delved deeper into the study of power, he began to understand that most people live their lives responding to forces they don't fully comprehend. They make decisions based on incomplete information, react emotionally to calculated provocations, and find themselves in situations they never consciously chose. This, he realized, was not accidental. It was the result of sophisticated manipulation techniques that had been refined over centuries. The fourth law, use others' emotions as weapons, while guarding your own. The cathedral bells of Florence rang out across the city as Machiavelli made his way through the crowded piazza. He had just left a meeting with Girolamo Savonarola, the fanatical monk whose sermons had convinced thousands of Florentines to burn their possessions in great bonfires of the vanities. Watching Savonarola work, Machiavelli had witnessed one of history's greatest masters of emotional manipulation. Savonarola understood that people made decisions with their emotions first, then used logic to justify those decisions afterward. He crafted his sermons to trigger specific emotional responses: fear of damnation, guilt over worldly pleasures, hope for spiritual redemption. Once these emotions were aroused, his audience became putty in his hands. They would agree to almost anything that promised relief from the emotional turmoil he had created. But Machiavelli also observed Savonarola's fatal flaw: the monk believed his own rhetoric. He had become as emotionally invested as his followers. When the political winds shifted and the Pope turned against him, Savonarola's emotional state became erratic.
He made desperate, irrational decisions that ultimately led to his execution.
His emotions, which he had wielded so effectively against others, had become his own weakness. This taught Machiavelli the dual nature of the fourth law. Emotions are incredibly powerful tools for influencing others, but they are equally dangerous when they control your own actions. The key is to understand and trigger emotions in others while maintaining emotional discipline in yourself.
Emotional manipulation works because most people are not aware of their emotional triggers. They believe their responses are rational when they are actually emotional.
A skilled manipulator might make someone feel excluded, then offer inclusion in exchange for compliance. They might create artificial scarcity to trigger fear of missing out. They might use flattery to lower someone's guard, or criticism to make them desperate for approval. Recognition of these techniques is the first step in defense. When you notice someone consistently trying to evoke strong emotions in you, especially negative emotions like fear, guilt, or anger, you should pause and examine their motives. When you feel pressure to make immediate decisions while emotionally aroused, that pressure is likely deliberate. The defensive aspect of this law involves developing emotional awareness and self-control. This doesn't mean becoming emotionless, but rather learning to recognize your emotional state and choosing your responses rather than simply reacting. When someone attempts to manipulate your emotions, you can acknowledge the feeling without being controlled by it. The fifth law, create dependence, not obvious control. Machiavelli's insight into dependence came from studying the relationship between the Pope and the various Italian city-states. The Catholic Church rarely conquered territories through military force alone. Instead, it made itself indispensable. Cities needed the Church's blessing for legitimacy, its networks for trade, its scholars for education, and its rituals for the major events of life and death. This created a web of dependence that was far more effective than direct control. A conquered city might rebel against occupying forces, but a dependent city had no realistic alternative to cooperation. The Church had made itself so integral to the fabric of society that resistance would require dismantling entire ways of life. Machiavelli observed this principle operating in smaller scales as well. The most powerful courtiers were not those who issued orders, but those who made themselves indispensable to the prince. They became the keepers of crucial information, the arbiters of access, the ones who understood how various systems worked. Their influence was less visible than that of obvious authority figures, but often more profound and lasting. This law explains why the most effective manipulation often doesn't feel like manipulation at all. Instead of forcing compliance through threats or pressure, sophisticated controllers create situations where others choose compliance because it serves their interests, at least in the short term. In modern contexts, this might manifest as a manager who becomes the sole conduit for important information, making themselves impossible to bypass. It might be a relationship partner who gradually takes control of financial accounts, social connections, or decision-making processes under the guise of being helpful. It might be a friend who positions themselves as indispensable by being the only one who truly understands you. The danger lies in the gradual nature of this process. Each individual step seems reasonable and beneficial. You appreciate having someone handle complex tasks for you. You're grateful for their expertise and assistance. Only over time do you realize that you've lost the ability to function independently in important areas of your life. Recognition involves paying attention to your own capabilities and autonomy. If you notice that you've become unable to handle tasks or make decisions you previously managed independently, if you find yourself having to go through one person to access information or resources, or if your life has become organized around someone else's indispensability, you may be experiencing this form of control. Protection involves maintaining your own competencies and connections. Don't allow anyone to become your sole source for important resources or information. Develop multiple relationships and capabilities. When someone offers to handle something for you, consider whether accepting will increase or decrease your own capacity to handle similar situations in the future. The sixth law, use selective honesty and generosity to disarm suspicion. The merchant prince Cosimo de' Medici had been dead for 30 years, but his influence still shaped Florence when Machiavelli served in the government. Cosimo had understood something crucial about human psychology: people are more easily deceived by those they trust, and trust is built through carefully calibrated displays of honesty and generosity. Machiavelli studied Cosimo's methods through the extensive records kept in the Medici archives. He discovered that Cosimo had made a practice of being completely honest about small matters while being deceptive about large ones. He would openly admit to minor mistakes, acknowledge small debts promptly, and be forthright about his limitations in areas that didn't matter to his core interests. This honesty about trivial matters created a reputation for integrity that provided cover for deception about crucial matters. When Cosimo claimed that a particular political alliance was motivated by friendship rather than strategic advantage, people believed him because they had seen him be honest about so many other things.
Similarly, Cosimo's generosity was strategic.
He would give lavish gifts to people at moments when those gifts would create maximum psychological impact, but minimal real cost to himself. A struggling merchant might receive a loan just substantial enough to solve his immediate problems. A rival might be invited to an exclusive dinner that acknowledged his importance while costing Cosimo nothing but time and food. These acts of generosity created debts of gratitude that could be collected later in the form of political support, favorable business deals, or simply silence when discretion was needed. People who had benefited from Cosimo's kindness found it psychologically difficult to oppose him or even to think critically about his motives. This law operates on the principle that humans are pattern recognition creatures. We form impressions based on limited data and, then, filter future information through those impressions. Someone who establishes a pattern of honesty and generosity in visible, low-stakes situations creates a cognitive framework that influences how others interpret their actions in high-stakes situations. The defensive application of this law requires understanding that someone's past honesty or generosity doesn't guarantee their current trustworthiness, especially when significant interests are at stake. When evaluating someone's claims or offers, focus on their incentives in the current situation rather than their past behavior. Pay particular attention when someone's generosity or honesty seems calculated to impress you or when it comes at moments when you're making important decisions about trusting them. Be wary of unsolicited favors, especially those that create a sense of obligation. Remember that people can be genuinely honest about small matters while being completely deceptive about large ones. Part 3, The Liberation from Control. The final part of Machiavelli's insights dealt with perhaps the most difficult challenge: how to free yourself from the various forms of control you may have unknowingly accepted. This requires not just understanding the mechanisms of manipulation, but developing the psychological strength to resist them, even when resistance comes at a cost. The seventh law, learn to play the fool. The insight for this law came to Machiavelli through his observation of Giovanni de' Medici, later Pope Leo X, during the latter's youth in Florence. Giovanni had a remarkable ability to appear less intelligent and less threatening than he actually was. In council meetings, he would ask seemingly naive questions that revealed the weaknesses in other people's arguments. He would make comments that appeared foolish on the surface but demonstrated a deep understanding of human nature. This strategic deception served multiple purposes. It caused potential rivals to underestimate him, making them careless in his presence. It encouraged others to reveal more information than they intended, as they felt comfortable speaking freely around someone they perceived as harmless. Most importantly, it allowed him to observe and learn while others focused on displaying their own cleverness. Machiavelli realized that appearing less capable than you are can be a powerful form of defense and gathering intelligence. When people believe you are not a threat, they let their guard down. When they think you won't understand the implications of what they're saying, they speak more freely. When they assume you lack the ability to harm them, they don't bother to protect themselves against you. This law is particularly relevant in competitive environments where displaying your full capabilities early might make you a target. In office politics, the person who immediately demonstrates their competence and ambition often finds themselves isolated and undermined. Meanwhile, someone who appears competent but non-threatening can build alliances and gather intelligence while others waste energy fighting more obvious threats. The key is knowing when to reveal your true capabilities and when to conceal them. This requires understanding the difference between situations where you need to be seen as competent, such as when being evaluated for important opportunities, and situations where appearing non-threatening serves your interests better, such as when navigating complex social or political dynamics. However, this law comes with risks. If you play the fool too well, you might actually be passed over for opportunities you want. If you hide your competence for too long, people might begin to believe your act is real. The art lies in strategic revelation, showing just enough competence to be taken seriously when it matters, while maintaining the ability to appear less threatening when that serves your purposes. The eighth law, control your own narrative. The final law emerged from Machiavelli's own experience with historical reputation. During his lifetime, he was known primarily as a competent but unremarkable civil servant. His controversial writings were not widely read or discussed. Yet he understood that history would judge him based not on the opinions of his contemporaries, but on how effectively he controlled the story of his ideas and contributions. He achieved this through his writing itself. By documenting his observations and insights in clear, compelling prose, he ensured that future generations would understand his perspective directly rather than through the interpretations of others. He didn't just present his ideas, he framed them within larger narratives about human nature, power, and political necessity that gave them lasting relevance. This law recognizes that perception often becomes reality, especially over time. The story that gets told about events, decisions, and people becomes the accepted truth, regardless of what actually happened. Those who control these narratives wield enormous power, while those who allow others to define them find themselves living according to scripts they never wrote. In personal and professional contexts, this means taking active responsibility for how your actions and motives are understood and remembered. It means not just doing good work, but ensuring that the right people know about it and understand its significance. It means framing setbacks and failures in terms of lessons learned rather than allowing them to be interpreted as evidence of incompetence. The law also involves recognizing when others are trying to control your narrative and actively resisting those attempts. When someone consistently mischaracterizes your motives, minimizes your contributions, or frames your successes as luck rather than skill, they are engaging in narrative control. The response is not just to correct the record, but to proactively establish your own version of events through documentation, witnesses, and strategic communication. In the digital age, this law has become more important and more complex. Social media creates permanent records of statements and interactions that can be taken out of context. Professional reputations can be shaped by online reviews, social media posts, and digital footprints that may not reflect reality. Controlling your narrative now requires active management of your digital presence as well as your offline reputation. The defensive aspect of this law involves developing media literacy and critical thinking about the narratives you encounter. When consuming information about public figures, political events, or even personal conflicts, ask yourself, who is telling this story, what are their incentives, and what alternative interpretations might be equally valid? The integration of all laws. As Machiavelli neared the end of his life, he reflected on how these 8 laws worked together to create a framework for understanding and navigating human power dynamics. They were not separate techniques to be applied individually, but interconnected principles that reinforced each other. The person who masters these laws becomes exceptionally difficult to control because they understand the mechanisms through which control operates. They recognize emotional manipulation before it affects their judgment. They see through artificial dependencies and maintain their autonomy. They understand the strategic use of information and don't allow themselves to be disadvantaged by ignorance. They control their own timing rather than responding to pressure from others. But, perhaps most importantly, they understand that true freedom comes not from avoiding all influence, but from choosing consciously which influences to accept and which to reject. They engage with the world as it is, not as they wish it were, while maintaining their own integrity and pursuing their own goals. The ultimate insight of Machiavelli's dark teachings is that power dynamics are inevitable in human relationships. The choice is not whether to participate in these dynamics, but whether to participate consciously and skillfully, or unconsciously and ineffectively. Those who understand these laws cannot be easily manipulated, exploited, or controlled. They can engage with others on equal terms, forming authentic relationships based on mutual respect rather than dominance and submission. In the end, Machiavelli's greatest lesson was that knowledge of human nature, however uncomfortable that knowledge might be, is the foundation of human freedom. Those who refuse to acknowledge these realities remain vulnerable to those who understand and exploit them. But those who embrace this knowledge can navigate the complexities of human interaction with wisdom, effectiveness, and integrity. The 8 laws are not just tools for avoiding control, they are principles for reclaiming your agency in a world where that agency is constantly under assault. They offer a path to genuine independence, not through withdrawal from human society, but through deeper engagement with it based on clear understanding of its true dynamics. These teachings remain as relevant today as they were 500 years ago because human nature has not fundamentally changed. The technologies and contexts of power have evolved, but the underlying psychological principles that Machiavelli identified continue to govern how people seek to influence and control each other. Understanding these principles is not about becoming cynical or manipulative yourself, but about developing the awareness and skills necessary to maintain your autonomy and pursue your goals in a complex social world. The person who masters these 8 laws does not become immune to all influence that would be neither possible nor desirable. Instead, they become conscious participants in the dance of power, able to recognize when they are being led and choosing whether to follow. They maintain the ability to form genuine connections with others while protecting themselves from exploitation. They engage with the world as mature, aware individuals who understand both the opportunities and the dangers that human relationships present.
This is Machiavelli's ultimate gift, not a guide to manipulation, but a manual for liberation from manipulation.
Not a blueprint for control, but a map to freedom from unwanted control. In understanding how power operates, we gain the ability to preserve our autonomy while still participating fully in human society. This is perhaps the most valuable knowledge of all, the understanding of how to remain free in a world where freedom is under constant assault.